Start. Hello and welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm here from Bard College and the Hannah Arendt Center in New York. And I'm going to be speaking today with David Bromwich. Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi. David is the Sterling Professor of English at Yale. He's written widely on Edmund Burke, a great book called The Intellectual Life of Edmund Burke, and another book, How Words Make Things Happen. He's also recently edited a new volume with 2 essays of Hannah Arendt on truth and politics, and that volume is called On Lying and Politics. So just let me say that this panel, this discussion here at Documenta 15 is co-organized by INSTAR, the Institute Artivismo of Hannah Arendt. Artivismo is a word made up, I think, for art and activism. So it's the way that art and activism come together, thought through the work of Hannah Arendt. And this is part of the INSTAR exhibit here at Documenta 15 by Tanya Bruguera. And I think she's joining us online as well. But for now, we're going to have a conversation about truth, politics, and the common world. So, David, it's great to be with you in conversation. Let me first ask by having you maybe tell us a little bit about why you published this new book on lying and politics, and what's in it, and what are these 2 essays of Hannah Arendt? One is called, I guess, Lying and Politics, and the other called Truth and Politics.
Right. Thank you. It's good to be here with you, Roger. The book is not something that was engendered by my conception. It comes from the Library of America, and the director of the Library of America, John Kulka, thought of combining these 2 essays into a small book that Americans would be interested in at this time. He asked me to write the introduction, understood to be a substantial introduction. So that's what I did. But I willingly did it, even though I don't deserve the title of editor, because it does seem to me a critical time for reflecting on just the issues that Arendt addressed with particular acuteness in articles she wrote in the late 60s and early 70s in response to the pattern of lies that was called euphemistically in America the credibility gap that emerged from the contrast between news reports and what could actually be known about the Vietnam War. So the first of those essays, the longer of the 2 on politics and truth, was, I think, published in the New Yorker in 1967 or 68. The second, from 1971, is actually a review of the several volume publication of the Pentagon Papers, which came out of a leak from a person who'd been employed by government but then became a defector from government, Daniel Ellsberg, in the early 1970s.
Right. So you said that there's a real feeling that these two essays, Truth in Politics and Lying in Politics, which address this credibility gap, are of the moment, as we would say, of timely today. Um, I can vouch for you that as someone who runs the Hannah Arendt Center, I get requests to speak, go out and write about these two essays now almost weekly. They are clearly contemporary. There's a feeling that lies have become omnipresent in our political world, and that there's a feeling that the truth has disappeared. That said, as you well know, Arendt was not a big defender of the idea that politics and truth were could coexist. In fact, she says very clearly that no one has ever counted truthfulness a political virtue, and she also says that truth and politics don't really go together. That politics is often about lying. So why is she writing these, and why is there so much interest in them today? Is it a misplaced interest, or is there a rightful interest in this combination?
Yes, well noted. Because Arendt, with her admiration of high politics, and particularly the aristocratic democracy of Athens, and the sort of recurrence of that she thought she could see in the town meetings and pattern of town assemblies in New England preceding and a little bit after too the American Revolution. Um, you know, this version of how should I put it, placing a political experience and a public life on such a height for Arendt made it rate above truth. Ordinary truth telling is necessary for human and social relationships, but politics is about something else, and it is about the defense of the polity, the political organization of people, which may require something other than the truth from those who lead the people. What people are in it for altogether is to persist as a form of life unmolested. So truth is secondary to that form of political experience for Arendt. But in a democracy, in a mass suffrage democracy, such has come to be very prevalent in the 20th century and even in the 21st, truth telling takes on a special importance, because there the importance of trust between anyone and anyone else living in the society is much greater. And so one might come to share a view very different from Arendt's about politics, to share rather, let's say, Montaigne's view of lying as the worst thing people can do to each other. And he says in his essay of Liars that he would, if he could, hang everyone who tells a lie. It's even worse than murder. Arendt would never go that far. But I think those essays of the late 60s and 70s and early 70s, even though they both contain the sentence you quoted or something very close to it, truth telling has never been counted a political virtue, have a different temper when one reads them in the context of mass suffrage democracy and the kind of trust that is necessary there. So Arendt is also the author of the epigram in almost these words, that in the environment of mass society, in totalitarian or near totalitarian conditions, truth becomes just another opinion. And she greatly feared that. Truth was of enormous value to her. It just wasn't a political value. So you don't want truth to become just another opinion. if you were to share a common world, that is to say, share a trust in each other that makes it possible for people to get along with each other, and even makes it possible for something we might call progress to take place.
Yeah, I think you've really hit on, to me, what is really important about Arendt's thinking on these matters, which is, on the one hand, as we said, um, Arendt thinks that truth is simply not an important political virtue. Uh, Politics is about opinions, and opinions aren't always opinions. They're not true. You said that, and I think clearly. And yet you've also said that for her, in some way, truth is absolutely essential in our common world, in a world that holds us together, which could also be called a political world, insofar as a political world is the world we share together. One of my favorite parts of the essay Truth in Politics is where she says that, it's often said in Latin, fiat justitia et pereat mundus, let justice be done even if the world perish. And she says that's not true, because the world is more important than justice. And if we have to suffer injustice for a time, it's better that the world persist. But she says that the similar line, fiat veritas, let truth be done, even if the world perish, is actually in a way true. Because if you let truth perish, there's no common world. There's no world that we share. If we can't talk about whether it's the Ukraine aggression or the Russian aggression or climate change or some other issue, if we can't talk about the basic facts of the world, then the world, common world, ceases to exist. And so the question then is, where do we find those truths? Is it in politics? Is it through experts? Is it through art? How does one go about? Truth is not something that comes down from the sky for her. Where does one, how does one cultivate truth in a world, as you've described it and she described it, where opinions increasingly replace truth in our political world?
Um, a short comment on your inclusion there of the arts as a possible source of truth, since the arts are by definition fictive, and yet anyone who has ever loved a novel or a poem or an opera or a dramatic work has felt this is true. This is true to life. Some deep human truth is being conveyed to me here. I'm going to beg off the problems about including art in the category of truth by just quoting David Hume, who says, truth is disputable, not taste. And when he says truth is disputable, he doesn't mean truth is just another opinion, but that things we can argue for with scientific, mathematical, or whatever, logical kinds of evidence are subject to contestation. And the person who has the better evidence, who has the better arguments and evidence, comes out being believed and rightly believed. Taste develops over time, so the arts are a more complex and historical branch of what we might call humanly truthful than we could say of scientific truth. But there's about the common world. I do think that Arendt, with her attachment to high politics and the patterns of high politics in the classical past and in Europe and in the United States in the 18th century, that she missed a kind of implicit logical connection between the survival of the common world and the availability of truth, and even the importance of truth beyond what she was inclined to accord it. She liked to quote as an example of an abstract truth the Socratic maxim, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. Well, but if you think about that, in order to know what is wrong, you have to know what's really happening in the world. What not only what the state of the laws is, but who did what to whom and when. So acting on that abstract truth, which she would have rated much higher than truth in politics. It is the high philosophical commitment of Socrates. We must be able to know what's happening in the world. And at the present moment, a great deal of that knowledge is entrusted to experts and those who translate down the expert knowledge, namely journalists. And I think there is a feeling, partly well taken, and partly just an exaggeration of a general distrust, that the experts are no longer reliable. In America, this distrust, I should think, stems in a large degree from the chaos and shambles of our COVID policy and of the people who passed it down and have sued, even though by and large something intelligent was done and something medically sound was done. But there are a great many other sources of it, of course, and we're in a situation now, in the United States anyway, where if you're curious to find out the truth, you have to go to different sources, almost different families of sources, to find out the truth about, say, climate change on the one hand, and the state of immigration at the southern borders on the other hand. The people who will tell you the truth about climate change, the journalists who take that as their mindful responsibility, will not talk about immigration. And those who are preoccupied with the troubles of immigration are not interested in climate change and even deny it. This is a new situation, and I think it's in a different category of inaccessibility or difficulty of access for truth than even Arendt was aware of in looking through the Pentagon Papers and thinking of the history of lying on U.S. foreign policy.
There's a lot there. I want to table the issue of art and maybe come back to that at the end. But let me just follow up on I think the really important points you made about experts and the attempt to articulate truth, because it does raise a question of what truth is, right? Is truth an objective claim about the world? You said to say what is. How does one say what is? Arendt clearly thought that there were some truths that were objective, things like 2 + 2 is 4, mathematical truths, or maybe logical truths. But I think one of the important things that you're raising is that in the world, in the political world, truth doesn't exist like that. Truth is something that comes from the basic plurality of the world, which is that we all come from different worlds, different perspectives. We all have our unique take on it. And as you said, in order to find out the truth about something, whether it's climate change or racism or COVID, you have to really sift through millions, okay, maybe thousands, whatever, of opinions, and understand that what they lead to is not a stable truth, but some sort of a emerging common ground that we can share. But that emerging common ground always is going to include disagreements, which means that truth contains within it a kind of humility, I think, in Arendt's telling. A kind of, I'm going to tell you what the truth is, but I'm going to know it from my perspective, and I'm going to have to be willing to listen to others who disagree with me and test my thinking against theirs in a public way. And that's a very different idea of truth than I think many of us operate with in the common and in the political world. How do you do that? How does one go about that? Or is that right?
I'll bring in another word which has much less liability to be capitalized than truth with a capital T. And that is just reasonableness, to adhere to a way of stating facts about the world that is reasonably trustworthy. So, I mean, let's use a present day example. Arendt quotes, I think in both of the essays that are in this little book, the statement by Clemenceau that people can argue about the origins of the First World War, but nobody will ever say Belgium attacked Germany. That's just non-factual. You have to live in a defactualized place to believe that you could reverse it, that you could take that proposition either way. Well, in Ukraine today, I should think no one will say Ukraine invaded Russia. There is a fact of the case. Russia invaded Ukraine. But then we can move from that fact to motives, causes, reasons being given. So Vladimir Putin, who ordered the invasion, has said one of its goals is the denazification of Ukraine. That's easily spottable by any halfway informed person as an enormous exaggeration. But it has been said on the American side by people urging unlimited support for the war and who want the war to go on. It has been said there's absolutely no truth to that. There's no history of Nazism in Ukraine. It's a complete distortion. Well, it should be possible to say that the claim about denazification is a gross exaggeration by a person doing it for political reasons, and yet also say there is a history of anti-Semitism. There is a history of cooperation with Nazism in Ukraine, and there is a history of racial subordination in Ukraine that continued even past 2014. Both of these statements should be possible to hold in mind at the same time, but it now requires, a good deal more resourcefulness by the individual citizen to find the places where you can discover the facts on both sides. And that doesn't, I think, leave one, hopeless and hesitating in the middle, not knowing what stand to take on this or that issue. But in a democracy, much more than any other form of polity, it becomes the duty of the citizen who is going to bear responsibility for things done in his or her name, to be informed. And I think this was the thing Arendt confronted, much against her own taste in political matters, when she looked into the history of the Vietnam War in those essays of the late 60s and early 70s.
So how does a citizen do that today? I mean, I'll take you as an exemplary citizen. How do you, when you're looking at a claim of who's responsible for a war, the Ukraine-Russia war, how do you go about sifting through those opinions? How does one do that?
I regret to say that one spends too much time at it. One looks at a multitude of sources, 12, let's say, where one might have looked at 2 or 3 in the past. And the extremely variable trustworthiness of online sources makes this, even more of a complex game. I can trust the New York Times, which is very pro-Ukraine, very openly so in its reporting as well as in its editorial stand, to tell me what the Ukrainian government is saying and what progress there has been by the Ukrainian armed forces. I might, if I want to know what Russian authorities are saying about their goals, just what they're saying, I might check RT, Russia Today. I understand that in many parts of Europe, you can't even go into that site, but it's a very, short-winded, matter-of-fact series of quotations for the most part. So you can check back and forth between, resources that are really openly taking opposite sides in a conflict. But I also think, there's a burden on one to discover who are authorities who, from their past, from the way that statements they've made check out, you might want to trust on the next question in this or that realm of policy. For example, the COVID policy in the United States attracted a statement by 3 dissenting doctors, Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford University and 2 others from Harvard and from Oxford, highly reputable people in virology and biological medicine, who had a different position from what the government position was on, for example, children getting vaccinated and the opening of schools. These positions were largely discredited by establishment media in the United States. They were, if you will, delegitimated. But read around and you can decide, I think, how good their facts are, how much the statistics check out with the assertions being made. And for more ordinary political discussion and trying to make up one's mind, I think it matters when in online sources the reporter or the institution is showing you links to original documents that support their view, and the documents are not forgeries. That's one way to work at it. And supposedly factual accounts that give you no links or quite unreliable links, just opinions that link to other opinions, you might as well shove to the side because they're worthless.
At the end of the first essay, Truth and Politics, Arendt says that, in essence, what truth is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above us. It's one of my favorite quotes of all of her writings, actually. And I take that to mean that the truth, that, as she said, you can't let the truth disappear, because if you do, we have no ground to stand on and we have no sky above us. And yet, as you rightly said, in order to understand any particular issue today, you have to read really multiple divergent views, and you have to find trustworthy liberal, trustworthy conservative, trustworthy radical, trustworthy critical views. And so in Russia, I read the Medusa channel, I read the Ukrainian channels, as well as some of the others you mentioned. It's very difficult to do. But are we in danger today of losing this common ground and this sky that stretches above us? Do you think that we're at the point where they actually may fall apart? And what would that mean?
That's a very hard question, and I try not to think about it too much and not to get discouraged. I suppose the best cure for one's doubts about the ground under one's feet and the sky above is to commit oneself to a particular issue where facts are knowable and there isn't so much disputation as a willingness to talk about it and an unwillingness on the other side to talk about it. So I would pick climate change, catastrophic climate disruption, as an example of that. I think there's no scientific disagreement worth counting on the fact that it is true that the climate of this planet we all share, this common world, is changing so rapidly that the planet will approach uninhabitability in large stretches of it 2 or 3 generations from now, if extraordinary measures are not taken in this generation. That seems to me the case, and that seems to me, therefore, an unimpeachable cause that one could align oneself with and try to get more facts on and think what one might do as a citizen of the United States, of Germany, of Russia, wherever. I think the trouble for us, the way we are built as human beings, is that we're distracted and multiple stimuli appeal to us, and we want to be on the right side of this or that cause. So that, for example, I'm going to pick the case of Ukraine one more time. People who support Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion in that war are also capable of saying, let's send them billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons. Let's do something called defeat Russia, which somehow means more than get rid of the invasion, though what it means is never specified, and who think that firing off all these weapons, putting weapons into new hands that we don't know the identity of, is quite compatible with a whole-length commitment to climate change. It is not. It is not. If we believe that climate change is a disaster almost on us, then the age of good wars, good long wars, is over. It's just over. and diplomacy, humanity, and the rest should be more interested in solving the disagreements that led to the wars than we now are. But I think ancient loyalties and passions that go into, for example, patriotism, local patriotism, nationalism, which exists all around, these are very hard to rid ourselves of, or hard to, you know, um, uh, to grow detached from. But if Arendt's phrase that you quoted about the common world means anything, it means that that sort of detachment is going to be necessary if we're going to avow and affirm our attachment to the world.
So this is a question that bothers me to no end. So I'm going to put it to you, and let's see if I can bother you, and maybe you can help me. Let's say we care deeply about climate change, as you have just said you do, and I do as well, and I think most of us do. And yet there's all sorts of misinformation, bad information, exaggerated information that makes it hard to get to the common sense, the common ground that we walk on, and the sky that stretches above us. And so one argument is, well, we try and turn to experts or facts. And yet all sorts of evidence shows that through cognitive biases and other reasons, people don't really listen to facts if it doesn't fit their narrative, their sense of what they want. And so some people, like William Davies, who's going to be speaking up at Bard in a few weeks, argue that we've entered a new world of nervous politics, nervous states, and that reason and rationality don't really work. And if we want to solve a problem like the climate, we have to stop trying to rationalize it and engage in the kind of hyper partisan or hyper propagandistic ways of articulating our position that the other sides do, because that's the only way we'll win. And so there's this argument that, you have to sort of see it as a battle of propaganda and try and win that. Is there still a place for moderate, rational, political, persuasive discourse, or are we past that?
So there's two questions there. One, or two matters. I'm going to divide your comment into. One is the difficulty, the apparently very, very peculiar difficulty in getting consensus on climate change as just a brute fact, as something we all recognize and all agree on. And the second is the utility or the advisability of a policy of deliberate exaggeration by good people like us who know the truth about climate change, for example, so that we exaggerate, so that we call names against the other side, so that we try to rope in the people who are our ground troops and, bring persuasion as close as it can get to coercion without maybe passing over the line. I can't go along with that strategy or a technique because it seems to me immoral. If you know something you recognize to be the truth, you speak what you recognize to be the truth, or you tell as much of it as you can. That's the politique element in it. But you don't say anything but the truth. You don't say anything that is not the truth. But you're right that our reliance on experts has not been working out very well on that issue as on some others in recent years. And I don't know how to account for the fact, but it does seem to me a fact, that there has not been any major, national level effort, and certainly hasn't been any success in what effort we've had at popular education on the subject of climate change. There's been popular now miseducation about vaccinations in general, going back to polio, smallpox, and all the rest, from the suspicions about COVID. But there's never been, even though, the American understanding of this as a crisis goes back to Jimmy Carter's administration when he put solar panels on the roof of the White House. And, that was undone by the successor president, Ronald Reagan, who took the solar panels off. But we've known this for almost 50 years. An educated, person who happened to be president, like Jimmy Carter, knew it. But scientists who can, speak American that cats and dogs can understand don't seem to be as common on the ground as you would like them to be. And there has been no program of popular education on this subject all over the map, in adult education, in the media, and so on, comparable to what there's been in this way and that, but you can add it up on, for example, civil rights and race relations. I think the general understanding of the history of the conduct of Americans toward Black Americans is now much better understood than it was 50 years ago. But the problem of climate change is not. I would hope for a change on that. I would hope for some body of scientists who are capable of conducting popular education to be brought in, and the government to sponsor it. It's a much more worthwhile project than many things they do sponsor. But we certainly haven't seen that. And so my hope is, looking back, to suppose that it just hasn't been given a proper chance.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, one of the problems, of course, is just the lack of scientific education and literacy amongst the population. I think people can understand the injustice or the facts of race relations in a more intuitive, visible level than they can what melting glaciers do and do not mean for climate change. I mean, Stephen Coleman, who's written some very good things on climate change, has a piece in the Wall Street Journal just today arguing that, again, the melting glaciers are a problem and need to be understood, but are being radically misused by media to explain the problem. And I think most people just don't understand it. And I think the problem, I agree with you that if you start trying to propagandize, we know the truth, here's how we're going to convince people. Unfortunately, the problem, and this is the problem Arendt saw in World War II as well, is that in the end, if you try and do that, all you lead to is cynicism and a complete lack of trust of all authority. And that may be why we're having all this problem with experts that you've been talking about.
There is, I think, and you see this in the realm of education, including higher education and culture. There is a real crisis of authority. Arendt talked about that in essays that she put into her book, Between Past and Future. But I think it's become much more radical a crisis now. She makes a very interesting point about the distinctiveness of authority, that it is that authority has broken down when you have to use persuasion, and that authority no longer exists when you have to resort to force. It is neither violence nor argument that constitutes, the essence of authority. Authority is someone who is rightly trusted, who says, this is the way we do things, and who is consented to, who is not blindly obeyed, but consented to on the basis of the knowledge that this is a reliable authority. And we have, I'm afraid to say, education authorities who are unwilling to speak in that simple voice of authority about historical facts. Roger, a moment ago, you used the word narrative. I hate that word narrative. Narrative means that I can have my narrative and you can have yours. And somehow, even though they radically contradict each other on such and such facts, it doesn't matter, because my narrative makes me happy and your narrative makes you happy. And we're not fighting about it yet. It's very important to not confuse history with story, and not confuse, a sequence of, let's say, connected truths with something called a narrative. But there's been so much tenderness, so much backward hesitation to correct people's mistakes by authority, that I think that itself has exacerbated the crisis. Authority tries persuasion when it shouldn't. And the resort to force by legal authorities, for example, often seems to be used before it should be. So that is a problem in the society, and it's very hard to see quite what to do about it.
Yeah. Now you've raised another part of her essay, Truth in Politics, that I find deeply important and I think often not understood by some of the people who write about it, which is that she says that while truth has to stay out of politics, politics depends upon truth, but it has to be founded and formed in institutions that are outside politics, like law, like medicine, like um, journalism, things like that. And these institutions are supposed to be dedicated to articulating truth and have authority, not persuasion. And they've lost that. And one of the commentators today who I think understands this better than others is Yuval Levin at the American Enterprise Institute, who's argued that institutions used to be about creating norms for behavior within the people in them. So if you're a newspaper, you teach people how to be a journalist, which means don't take your own opinion to report the facts. And if you're a lawyer, you work on simply representing the law and your client. And if you're a doctor, you do this. And institutions built a kind of normative world. Whereas today, institutions have become platforms for self-promotion. So if you're a journalist, you tweet and you say, I'm a journalist, and that gives you credibility, but you tweet whatever you want and other things like that. It seems to me that the kind of authority you're talking about depends upon an institutional life that is in danger today. And especially at universities, how does a university professor enter the public world and not lose their institutional normative Ausbildung, their formation?
Yeah. Um, well, one way to lose it is to uh, enter wholesale into the participating in the ethic of just reactions, just spot reactions to events in the world or to statements you've read that some public figure has made, and to feel that as a scholar or as a professional of some sort who has earned a certain rank and respect, that you're just going to try and overwhelm people with the number and interestingness of your reactions. But Arendt's advice in an interview to stop and think really bears reflecting on, because thinking, another word of hers that is closely related to the maintenance of a common world, thinking isn't done in the form of fast reactions. So yeah, it seems to me, a trahison, a betrayal of what should be the calling of a scholar, to try to make your mark by having influence, as in the form of the fast reactions you are known for. What to do about the need, perhaps, for an institution separate from government, as you cited Arendt saying, of people who can be trusted to not establish the truth, but be a source to go to find out the state of things in this or that area of knowledge. That's a favorite um, uh, solution, not just of Arendt, but of other intellectuals in the last couple of centuries. John Stuart Mill, I believe it's in his book Representative Government, thought it would be a good idea if there was a certain select number of members of parliament who didn't have to run for election, who would be appointed by virtue of their scientific or cultural knowledge, a form of what one of his predecessors, I suppose you'd say, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, called the clerisy, a whole separate order of advising thinkers who nevertheless would have respect in Parliament. That never caught on. The Parliament of Britain doesn't have any such set of people, and nor do we have anything like it in the United States. I mean, if you think about the institutions governing health, and what's been understood about them over the viral the COVID crisis of the last couple of years, it turns out they aren't very well organized, and they don't answer legitimate questions about their investments with much honesty or even much competence. And all that sort of trust has to be built up over time, and I suppose it can be lost in very much less time than it takes to build it up. What you said about journalists is, of course, very pertinent to the American situation today, because there's a new ideal based in some ways on genuine idealism, but its results, its product in practice are cynical. An ideal that journalists call moral clarity. The idea is that a journalist covering a story, let's say covering a story about one of the 2020 protests that went by the name Black Lives Matter, where in various cities the protests turned into riots, vandalism, and violence to some extent at nighttime. A whole grouping of those reporters tasked with giving journalistic account of those events just declined to report on the second part, on what was happening at night in the cities that had the admirable protests, peaceful protests during the daytime. Why did they refuse? Out of moral clarity. Moral clarity says, I tell the truth about this and just not talk about that. And I think, again, there, it has to do with your understanding of the separate vocation of what it is to be, say, a reporter. I just mentioned what it is to be a scholar, and that shouldn't include wanting to have a lot of fast reactions. Well, a reporter should not be someone who declines to report inconvenient facts. You want to give the whole story as far as possible so that people continue to trust the institution you're part of. And the kind of divided commitment that I think a great many, especially youthful reporters in America, now have. I can't betray the cause. My reporting has to reflect the cause I'm committed to, has been very destructive of public trust. And it's what leads people, to take this newspaper or that newspaper, to read the New York Times, but not the New York Post, or vice versa. Whereas, in fact, unfortunately, very different families of fact are covered accurately in one journal or the other.
I can't agree more. We have about 10 minutes left, and because I know David has to run to teach. I have more questions, but if there are questions from the audience, we'd love to take them. So if there are, make it known to me, but I'll ask. Is there one? No? I'll ask a question. You guys can think about it. I want to return to the question of art. You said before art is fictive, right? And of course it is. Art is an artifice. It's a making of an artificial thing. And that's core to Arendt's understanding. And yet we are, as human beings, artificing beings. We're artistic beings. We make things. And so the world we live in is never a natural world, a purely given world. It's a world that we make. It's a world of the human world, or a human condition. And when we talk about a common world, Arendt says, most things that we make, we consume, and thus don't last. And it's the things that last the longest that contribute to what we share, the common world. And the prototypical example of that are two things. One are political communities, states, which supposedly last over time. And the other is artworks, things that are not consumed, but persist over time. And for both of her, and so in it's these two things, politics and art together, that for her help form the common ground we stand on in the world sky that stretches above us. I'm wondering to what extent art plays a role in politics in this way. To what extent can artists, and here I'm We're at a panel sponsored by the Institute for Artivismo, Art and Activism of Hannah Arendt. I think Arendt is in some ways uh, suspicious of pure activism, but really does believe that art, as that which that makes things that are seen to be worth lasting and that thus do last, can change the world and meaningfully do so. And I'm wondering how you understand that aspect of her work.
Um, yeah, it's a fascinating train of thought. Um, and yes, the political artifice and works of art for her represent two branches of human activity that are most admirable. Um, what does the political artifice create? It creates the city. It creates the polity. And the artist, the individual artist, creates the work of art, the great tragedy or the great lyric poem. Um, you know, the way Arendt looks at it, I believe, is that both of these human makings, if you will, um, are sources of a legitimate pride that human beings can feel about what human nature has done. And a very good commentator on Arendt, from whom I've learned a lot, George Kateb, talks about this as human stature. It's not just human dignity. Stature may be a better word for it. And I think it's true that for Arendt, it's by these makings, these buildings up that go into an individual work of art or into the civic life of a polity, that we come to feel a general self-respect. And in the light of that self-respect, we can act better, more appropriately, more generously where appropriate. That's an idea very close to her, so close to her that she never says it quite outright once, but she says it in a myriad ways, sketching around the idea. She's not the only I think, political uh, thinker who has um, come into this train of thought. Another is Edmund Burke, who says in the somewhere in the Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs, art is man's nature. The art is our nature, to make things, to do, and for him, society was the work, perhaps more than a polity. But I mean, there's a great passage from Arendt, from a relatively early essay on Kafka, that I wanted to copy it out because I thought it might come in useful today. Let me read it because it's right on the point you were making, Roger. Um, and she's talking about the way that man can destroy human stature by merely descending into part of nature, into part of necessity, or rise above it. And the passage goes like this: as a functionary of necessity, man becomes an agent of the natural law of ruin, thereby degrading himself into the natural tool of destruction, which may be accelerated through the perverted use of human capacities. Just as a house which has been abandoned by men to its natural fate will slowly follow the course of ruin, which somehow is inherent in all human works, so surely the world, fabricated by men and constituted according to human and not natural laws. So we've constructed the world according to human and not natural laws, but it will become again part of our nature and will follow the law of ruin when man decides to become himself part of nature, a blind though accurate tool of natural laws, renouncing his supreme faculty of creating laws himself and even prescribing them to nature. Prescribing the law to nature is one of Kant's definitions of a work of art. And I think you can see there, very vividly, the idea of building up as the most honorable, the most dignified activity of people in groups, if we're talking about a polity, and persons separately, if we're talking about the making of works of art. But just as there is building up in those ways, there's also for Arendt, and that's what ruin means for her, building down to become a functionary of necessity. And you can see there her real contempt for instrumentalism, her contempt for, arithmetical utilitarian calculus. She wants something greater and something better. And I think she finds it in art as she finds it ideally in politics, but maybe in modernity. It has been more generally accessible from works of art than from anything in political experience.
That's beautifully said. And that may be a good place for us to end unless there is a question out in the audience. I'm going to remind people that tomorrow this series will continue with a discussion on freedom, art, and politics with Olivia Guaraldo. And then on Friday, the 23rd, which is the day the new INSTAR exhibit opens, we'll have a discussion of Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and anti-Semitism with Thomas Mayer, Frieder Schnuck, and Renata Stee, two Berlin artists. So I hope you'll come back Thursday and Friday at 5 o'clock here in this space or online. I want to thank again David Bromwich for this really wonderful and provocative conversation, and INSTAR for hosting us at Documenta 15. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.